We are okay. We have three things to do. The first is to take, if there are now comments or questions, a few minutes on Judith and Susanna presentations. I would say that the third issue that was mentioned is if transparency is important, how much transparency can do, and instead how much we need the rules. And then there was there was this Judith showed us as somehow we were thinking with her intervention to the demand side, but the demand side is becoming a sort of supply side, even the demand side. So that's an interesting development that we are all seeing in the issue, and the influence on pluralism is also interesting, even if there is also the elements about how somebody can become a private gatekeeper in this kind of activities. Then Susanna showed us not only her general activities, but this new project that I find very interesting, and we'll see how it will relate with the others ways to measure and monitor pluralism. And it's interesting, this concentration of the project on the negative intervention of the state, that is a way to tackle the issue from a precise side, if you want. Okay, if there are comments on, we can take, or if not, we'll take those issues as the others in the general discussion. Okay, Peggy.
I had two questions for Judith. I really found your presentation very fascinating, and I was struck by the fact that it's apparently not only China shutting down blogging facilities when something changed, but also The Guardian. It's the first time I hear that actually a UK medium or a Western medium did that. They didn't. What do you mean by not opening?
Just comments weren't available.
Were not available. Well, it's a bit similar to what they did in China just like 3 weeks ago. And
I'm. Same thing at all. No, I don't think it's the same thing at all. It's rather misleading.
No, but what happened in China 3 weeks ago was.
On the internet. Sorry.
Was that they also asked the providers to block the comments function like 3 or 4 weeks ago, when there was this rumor that a revolution would start in Beijing and that tanks were already coming in.
I think, I mean, don't speak for The Guardian, but I would imagine it was simply they didn't have the resources to pre-moderate some of the comments, and clearly something which was potentially libelous or prejudicial could have been put on the site. I think so I would imagine it was simply a question of they wanted to pre-moderate.
Mm-hmm. No, but actually, whether there are similarities with China was not really what I was going to ask, but just your views on, do you then, would you then argue in favor of more or less responsibility for the traditional selection intermediaries like the newspapers that offer such a comment function? And my second question relates to what you said about I'm following a couple of friends or people that I find important, and they lead me in what I read, but doesn't that in the end that doesn't change something about the people that bring the stories? I mean, it's your friends saying you should read this and that in the newspaper, right? So it's not like there are more sources out there now. But it's just different. Instead of your girlfriend in the morning saying you should read this, it's just like more people guiding you, or people that you trust guiding you in what to read. But it's, am I making myself clear? Was that yeah?
Let's see. Do we have other comments, or if not, we have in the meantime Judith answer.
Right. I think in response to the first question, whether we need more regulation of these, citizen journalists, shall we say, that is, of course, going to be the $64 million question, because we're seeing this in many areas. I mean, a lot of journalists I know are very unhappy about being, within this restrictive straitjacket that they have to operate in if everybody else can go out there and can say pretty much everything about everybody. That's the one issue. The other thing is, of course, one of responsibility. And even though I am a lawyer, I haven't really made up my mind about this, but B, I'm not actually sure that the law is the best way of dealing with it, because I think one of the regulatory modes that we haven't fully explored in the online context and that we really need to start exploring is that of social norms. What do we feel morally and culturally obliged to do and not to do? And I think that is one of the things that where we're just so at the beginning of everything. There's all this stuff about people acting online in a way that they wouldn't act offline, and do we need to grow up online is one of the questions. Do we need to achieve the same social, moral, and ethical standards online that we have offline? And it's a question I can't answer at the moment. I think there are pros and cons. I do hate trolls for a start. I do hate people who abuse their online privileges. I do hate people on Twitter who abuse a woman who has been raped, which is something they could not do offline. At the same time, I blog anonymously or pseudonymously, particularly because I just want to be able to try out stuff. And because I have adopted social norms where I'm trying not to hurt anyone, I feel that's okay. And I want to be able to do that. And I don't want regulation that makes me absolutely responsible for everything that I say in that environment, because for me it's still a playing field. So I think there are things to take into account either or. I think the point I wanted to make is that we need to start thinking about it. Mm-hmm. We need to just not ignore this and say this is private activity of private citizens, because it no longer is that. With regard to the second one, what I would call probably the effect of selection. Of course, you're right. It is still the same stuff, although it is not entirely the same stuff, because I am, through this selection of the people I follow, increasingly drawn to non-traditional media. So, the stuff that I click through to is not just the Guardian articles and the Mail articles and the Independent articles. It is actually blogs by people I've never heard of, that somebody else has found worthy enough to tweet and to retweet, and so on and so on. So I think from that point of view, it's a question of accessibility of non-traditional media that is actually enabled, facilitated through the use of these redistribution facilities that are Twitter. I think the other thing is also actually reality. Each and every one of us has so much brain power to contend with, so many hours in the day, so much time they can spend on actually informing themselves. And this is, I think, where these programs or these platforms like Twitter come in. That I actually give people the right to pre-select to a certain extent for me, because I trust them to find the stuff that I'm interested in. Now, this restricts me and empowers me in equal measure, because it basically gives me the extra time to read more stuff, because I don't have to search for it. But it also, of course, frames what I'm reading. And I think from that point of view, it is actually important for traditional media, and it has an effect on traditional media, because the equality of access changes. I'm not sure if I'm making myself very clear here, but if you only have a newspaper, then somebody picks up the newspaper, and depending on what sort of reader they are, they go either from the back to the front or the front to the back, or they go straight for the business pages, or they just read the celebrity gossip. But the way I'm doing this now is it gets thrown at me in a different way. It's much more individualized, personalized, targeted. And I think that makes a difference. And I think we're seeing that with media, with traditional media companies, in that they're trying to court this. If you're now writing an article in the same way as somebody who's writing a blog, you are actually trying to get this article retweeted, which is why the Guardian authors all tweet their articles. Because if you tweet it, then there is a chance of it being retweeted, and you generate readers from that process, and you're automatically advantaged over the people who don't do that, because you are accessing a different audience. You are accessing an audience that is specifically interested in this, and I think that is the difference.
Christina, yes, wanted. Yeah.
So thanks for the presentations a lot. What I want to say is that I've recently not seen any policy paper that doesn't start with the issue is complex. So that's where we are as well. Yeah, the issue is very complex, and we have discussed today so many aspects. Also yesterday, we still haven't actually really any good research or study about what the consumers want, or what are the criteria, how do they choose, how do they look, what is media pluralism from their side? We had a little bit of a grasp on that, but it was not exactly tackling this issue. So I think we have to look more into if there's any research that really looks into how users choose content and for what they go and how do they mix their individual consumption of information and media. So this is very important. What I see is that a big issue on policy inconsistency. Yeah, we are having again a regulatory framework that comes from a time when media was a bit more simple, a bit more easier also to define. We have television, broadcasting, and now this expanded concept of audiovisual media policy. But again, this concept is already challenged at all possible frontiers because, as we could hear nicely from the various presentations, there is new media and the actual boundaries are absolutely not clear, and it's also absolutely not clear how we are taking this into account in terms of assessing power relationships in the media, how we take into account, for example, the online edition of a newspaper, how we take into account something that is really as powerful as traditional media, potentially. So this is about how to develop a framework that is capable of embracing these new developments, but without over-regulating, obviously, as well. And then we get more and more also the traditional gatekeeper problematics that are coming from the side of the delivery infrastructures and all the new platforms, let it be devices or also platforms on the internet like social networks or other platforms for new media content that are moving themselves inside and trying to also concentrate their market power via the user base they can achieve. So all this is something that we could see today. Again, the picture is very much, our perspective is very much on the supply side. We have also not looked much today on input plurality. We have looked a lot on output plurality, but who produces what information, how concentrated the market is here. There is a lot of research out already, so this just would need to be summed up. And so I have to leave now soon. I thank you for participating and thanks for the constructive discussion.
Thank you, Christina. I think we have a couple of more interventions, then we move.
Susanna, concerning in the presentation of the future research that we are doing now, there is an element that for me is missing, but probably it exists, and is what is essential to understand the problem of pluralism is the unique sources of information that are accessed by a citizen. Is this considered? Because the fact that if a citizen has access to multiple sources, then the problem of the pluralism is reduced. The higher problem in the pluralism is when you have a unique source of access to the information that for a large part of the population that makes the problem really big. So if this is not considered, then
just one short question for Susanna. You mentioned that you want to find answers for regulation, media-specific regulation. What is the aim of your project? Do you want to find answers for a national regulation, or do you want to give answers for the EU, for EU-wide regulation? Perhaps this concerns also our discussion from yesterday on competency of the European Union on this issue.
Another question?
Yes, it's a question for Susanna. It's just I would just need a small clarification about what table that you showed at the beginning of your presentation. You displayed the evolution of the market share of public service broadcasting organizations. I was wondering what was the reference point as compared to what?
Maybe I start with the last thing first and just simply admit that this is a slide that I asked André for. I discussed with him what I could present, and he might have told me precisely, how he collected the data on, but I would now hesitate to give you what information that he had. I mean, it was that if maybe I should just put you in touch with André to get a very specific answer to that. The point was really just to show a development and to what extent actually the public service broadcasters haven't had such changes, that is still a stable market. That is, if you so want, that was the information that I wanted to get across, because public service is a key element when you look at pluralism. Those are the people on whom you can impose normally conditions as to what content you want to have. So it's also important to know what audience they reach. But the clear parameters, I think André can give that to you. To the other two questions. We do not want to find answers, nor do we want to stimulate any forms in terms of regulation, who should regulate what. That's not at all our goal. Actually, it would be contrary to our mandate if I attempted to do that. It might not have been clear enough about that, but the observator is really strictly observing, and you should see how many outcries you could potentially trigger if you overstep that line. We have two very clear messages. We are neutral, we don't depend on anybody, and we don't do anything for anybody. And we are not aiming at changing anything. And this is why I loved so much the fact that Judith was just put in front of me. I mean, we only have transparency as our Bible. Get information out there so that people do understand what they do. That's what our message is. What you do is your choice, but please understand it, base it on reality. And this, in a way, leads also a little bit to the other question, the unique sources of info for citizens. This is not a study as to how we do with pluralism. It's about market power. It's about the industry. How can you influence, or not how can you, but how do actually regulators, legislators influence the structure of the market? We're not looking into what do they do positively to give information outlets to citizens. That's also not the aim of the study. It's stock taking of what's there, what is developing, and I think at an interesting time where we are also uncertain whether we can still stick with the traditional media concept or whether we already have something new. We want to help this discussion, and by looking into, is there something new? And if there is, you will read this in November. And if there's not, you will read that too. And you might read there are countries who, however, have made the first step towards such an extension of existing legal frameworks. That's all we're doing.
Thank you, Susanna. I think we should. Okay, now in theory, we had two roundtables. Actually, I feel that also because of the discussion and the time, but in the end, it's only one roundtable that we want really to have here. Actually, we want a final discussion with some speakers that are already listed. So I propose to look at assessing the interdisciplinary meaning of pluralism and learning from methodology as a one only discussion, and the way in which I propose to go is this. We give first the floor to Siobhan Gray and to William Horsley and to Roberto Natale that has a specific proposal. I understand that he wants to tell us about. Yes, more or less. So we have this three opening intervention. Then we have some discussion. Then we have the other speakers that are in this that have to give a speech as a middle group, and then we'll give the conclusion, a sort of conclusion to industry representatives of some sort. That is some sort. Well, because the industry is complex at this point. A part of the industry. Well, I'm joking. Major part, okay?
Spoke for Murdoch.
Yes. So Ross Bigham and Giacomo Mazzone will, in the end, try a conclusion of this discussion. Okay, so we'll move on 3 groups. Okay, all right. So Siobhan.
Yes, good morning. My name is Siobhan Gray, and I'm an advocate, a lawyer from Doughty Street Chambers in London. My background is first and foremost in criminal law, but I've moved into media law in libel reading for newspapers and acting for the press. What I've been grateful for a little slot in order to advertise a new media forum, which is entitled United in Diversity, Pan-European Forum on Media Pluralism and the New Media, the emphasis being on the new media. And this is being coordinated by myself, and I'm most grateful to Professor Peggy Valk, who must be about 8 months now. We spoke for the first time, and Professor Valk decided to run with the idea of staging this event at the plenary chamber. And after much lobbying of parliamentary groups and meeting with the President's Cabinet, we have been given the privilege of staging the media pluralism event at the plenary chamber on Wednesday, the 27th of June. And the idea is to bring together all multi-stakeholders, all interested parties, from politicians, from a national level, MEPs, the media in its traditional form and in its new media form, regulators, academics, and of course lawyers, to engage in a forum. We are in the process of putting the speakers together. There will be some surprises, but I'm not in a position at the moment to let out any particular names. And the event will focus on media diversity and do the new media contribute to, for example, or undermine a pluralistic public sphere? Should there be diversity obligations for the new media, and can we impose them? And whether there is a need, should existing media ownership regulations for the traditional media be relaxed or extended to the new media? The new media for me, and I was fascinated by Judith's speech, because I've been looking at the new media from a slightly different perspective, coming with a criminal law background. And I've been most concerned, this is just slightly off the forum, but concerned about juries and the internet. In the United Kingdom, we have a criminal justice system whereby the defendant who's up on a criminal charge, their guilt or their innocence will be determined by a jury of 12 men and women. And strictly speaking, they can only determine guilt on the basis of the evidence they hear in court. But of course, with the new media and the accessibility of new media, juries have been looking for answers through the internet. Now, of course, that was the case in the past. Juries would go to the scene of the crime and try and find out the answer that they felt they probably weren't getting in the courtroom, just striving to get the right answer in some cases. But of course, with the internet, with the press of a button, they can go to Google Earth and it's all there for them. Furthermore, and taking Judith's point about responsibility with the new media, and you can effectively be anonymous. And we've had one particular case in the United Kingdom where a juror has gone online and spoken with an acquitted defendant while the jury was still deliberating on a case with other defendants. And she used a pseudonym. And she felt she was protected and distanced from this acquitted defendant to engage and talk about the case. Of course, she was found out and she was charged and was sent to prison. And how we've dealt with things in the UK is that jurors are now told that they'll go to prison if they do look on the internet, but nothing more. There's nothing more that we can really do than just warn them. So that's just a slight deviation, and how I've been seeing things from a criminal perspective and the internet. But of course, the event is focusing on diversity and also about how industry have faced the challenges presented by new media, for example, the publishing world and the music industry. Slightly off point, but we have to fill the room. It seats almost 900, and the Parliament are keen that, of course, we fill it. And of course, Parliament are keen that we have, in their words, substantial media coverage. So we hope that this is effectively just a save the day. Wednesday, the 27th of June, at the plenary chamber, with all interested parties engaging in a forum on new media diversity.
Oh. Let me make sure I've got this. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here. I think I should use my short time, I've been told to be brief, to do two things, really, which is, first of all, to talk about what's wrong, why it is that, as stakeholders, the media and a lot of NGOs are extremely unhappy about the legal and political reality in Europe. They increasingly have discovered that the institutions which speak loudly about freedom of expression and free press as a basis of democracy are not being sincere, that they are running away from the options that are presented for monitoring of media freedom matters, very specifically the Council of Europe, which used to have an office, a group in the office of the Secretary General doing this and reporting at a high level. So there were political interventions at a high level. This is about 10 years ago. That was dismantled 2 years ago. New proposals came forward because the situation is so very serious in so many countries of the Council of Europe, and not only in the East, but I'm talking about the deaths of 20 journalists in 3 years in Council of Europe areas, and the jailing of 95 journalists in one country, Turkey, where I was told in Strasbourg recently by an expert that effectively free media has been extinguished. I mean, free independent media has been extinguished in Turkey. You know, there is such intimidation, there is such fear, and this happens because of violence. It happens because of abusive laws, such as criminal libel, insulting the state in that particular case, but also the anti-terrorism and state security laws being abused since, particularly since 2001. But then other forms of pressure and abuse which are in the hands of governments to correct, which is to say access to information, failure to enact freedom of information laws, even excluding, in the case of Spain, as my journalist association, the Association of European Journalists, has been telling me from different sections. In Spain, it's now become quite commonplace for the political parties and others simply to exclude journalists either from press conferences altogether or to deny them the right to ask questions, or sometimes simply to supply video and other information to them without any two-way at all. Now, this is at the heart of, we know, I mean, Italy and its monopolistic situation in terms of, I knew you'd said that. I say it is not. Fine. Okay, you've said it. Well, it has been ruled actually by various bodies, including the Council of Europe, and in one particular instance, which I will cite to you, the Italian government was asked to change its TV regulations. But I mean, speaking with Italian journalists, it is perfectly clear that there is enormous pressure to be either part of the dominant group or to be excluded. Corriere della Sera, I think, was one example. But I mean, I think the point about this group is that we're able to speak openly, and of course things will be contested and everything is incomplete. But I think it is well understood outside Italy that the political interference has had become intolerable because of the ownership, not only ownership of a very large media group, but also publishing and also influence over public sector media. And the case of Hungary, again, illustrates that point. And in the case of Hungary, I think it raised the issue of the EU's own role and competence very starkly, because there were some expectations after the Lisbon Treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the initial responses from the Commission that there might be an intervention from the European Union on the basis of protecting freedom of expression and fundamental rights rather than just regulatory matters. And that was disappointed, and the excellent job of analysing the nature of the problem, 6 particular violations were identified by the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe. And we know that the European Union is due to be acceding to the convention, European Convention on Human Rights. So that raises a whole raft of questions, which we haven't got a lot of time to go into here, but some expectations. So my association since 2007 has done a series of surveys which detail from the field, in the eyes of journalists themselves, the kind of obstacles that they have faced. Our membership stretches from Spain and the West into Armenia and Ukraine in the East. So obviously the situation in the East is absolutely desperate, both in terms of the framework of laws and the abuses by law enforcers. Indeed, I think it's worth pointing out that the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe last year actually approved a set of guidelines for member states about impunity. That's to say, the systematic failure of many member states to deliver justice in cases where particularly state officials, I'm talking about police, prison officers and others, abuse their power to inflict violence or indeed to jail people for politically motivated or arbitrary charges. So the point is that this is becoming more systematic, and it is an irony after hearing graphic examples of the participation of citizens and citizens becoming creators of content and so on such a mass scale, to see that the non-governmental monitors like Freedom House systematically and in great detail analyze the ways in which they say that overall media freedom, press freedom, as well as other political freedoms across Europe, and they include Western Europe, are actually declining, actually getting worse. And this is something I think that a group like this, and particularly the Centre, its title overlaps with the centre of my other organisation, which is the Centre for Freedom of Media at the University of Sheffield, really have to grasp and confront and be aware of. So the numerous researches and surveys are invaluable in telling us what's going on, but reflecting some of the earlier comments, you can go on analysing and finding out data, but you're only going to make matters better if the governments and the EU, which is now acting as a quasi-government, has got attributes of the government, particularly when it joins the Convention of Europe itself, with its own judge, its own Court of Justice, applying those rules on EU legislation. You have to get up to speed with the international context. And I haven't got time here to go into, but there's the Centre for Freedom of the Media. And for example, I think it's got my OSCE the OSCE Safety of Journalists Guidebook, which they asked me to write, is a guidebook for governments about obligations under the OSCE, which are commitments, and it's a consensus organization, but they do have a track record because this is the Helsinki process and effectively the defeat of communist totalitarianism, and also the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other things which I think the EU really has to be aware of. I think it would be good to see the EU leading in this area and not acting sometimes as a closed shop, defending its own members. The OSCE people who deal with the ministers in Vienna say it is quite common for the EU member states to club together and to resist criticism or pressure of their own members in a way which others see as very unfair. And it's an example of double standards which doesn't do the European cause any good at all. So the Centre for Freedom of the Media in particular, we worked with UNESCO on the action plan for the safety of journalists, which is in the process of being approved and hopefully implemented. And I have to say that in the meeting in Paris in late March, EU states, particularly the UK, Netherlands and a number of others, were very, very helpful in staving off an attempt to destroy this initiative by states like India, Pakistan, Brazil, and others. But this is now a hot topic internationally, and the EU is the last of the major institutions to pick this up. The OSCE has got this. The UN has got this very, very important action plan, which hasn't had a lot of publicity, but it involves all UN agencies. The UN Human Rights Committee, which is a top body of lawyers on this, has come up with a very important new document called the General Comment number 34 on freedom of expression. It's the first time that that body has dealt with freedom of expression for, I think, more than 20 years, and it has got some extraordinary advice for governments about their obligations, their positive obligations on providing protection for journalists and others under threat who are exercising their freedom of expression. This is not for journalists because they have some label saying they're journalists. This is because of their function. And also on access to information and so on. These are the new guidelines, the new template, effectively, and I think it would be only natural to expect the European Union states to be in the forefront of that, and the European Commission, as the guardian of those values, to be taking a lead. I have specific thoughts which I would like to be able to contribute to the Centre and others about in what form the EU might exercise its competences using the Fundamental Rights Agency and raising the profile of this issue in a political sense as well as in a legal sense in member states and, of course, in its external policy as well. And here we are, the research materials of the impunity initiative, the initiative on impunity and the rule of law, which we worked up last year. This is an initiative of the University of Sheffield Centre, where I work, and also the City of London Centre for Law, Justice and Journalism. The legal instrument study is a global survey of the existing commitments of states on freedom of expression and journalism, and the political aspect study focuses more on the European side, but has also, as you see, it's got input from many sides, including the European Parliament and indeed the External Action Service. If I may, I'll just take one more minute to say something about, I think this last week in Britain has actually told everybody an enormous amount about the general crisis and indeed survival crisis of the media in the UK and beyond. We heard from Rupert Murdoch himself. First of all, he disowned the News of the World. In other words, public opinion has got to the centre of power, media power, and that is combined with an enormous amount of activity among the Society of Editors, that's the top media editors and managers in the UK, about improving self-regulation and a binding system. The new head of the still surviving Press Complaints Commission has talked about a new system which would be a binding contract between all substantial mainstream media and the new body, which would be more effective, but would keep the editor's code. The editor's code, I think, is regarded internationally as really a model of its kind. And by the way, it does include the phrase, freedom of expression is itself a fundamental right. The other thing he said is that it's all over within 20 years. He expects not to be printing any newspapers, which I thought was pretty drastic. But he also said that he thought that he approved the idea of a conscience clause in the new setup, whatever it is, to protect journalists against the kind of pressure which we see absolutely everywhere in Bulgaria, in Ukraine, but I mean in member states and beyond, from their editors, their managers, and their owners. So I commend that thought to you. Thank you.
Thank you, William. We finished this 3 presentation with Roberto Natale from the Italian and European Journalists Association. Roberto.
Yes, the proposal that Mr. Parker has referred to is the proposal of a citizen initiative according to the Treaty of Lisbon. As you know, this is a new possibility introduced by the Treaty of Lisbon. 1 million signatures collected in at least 7 countries in Europe, in European Union. We are thinking about this initiative because we too are obviously, of course, deeply worried about the situation of pluralism of information in Europe, not only in Italy, of course. Even if just a few words about the Italian situation, perhaps you read this note by an Italian expert. Our position is precisely the opposite about the situation in Italy. And perhaps it's important to know that this expert is considered in Italy one of the ghost authors of the Gasparri law, of the ongoing law in Italy, and that is also the most important candidate for the Berlusconi's party for the presidency of the AGCOM, which is going to be appointed. But this is a European seminar. So not only Italy is the problem. Hungary, said just now the colleague, perhaps also in Great Britain the Murdoch case is changing the atmosphere about the pluralism of information, about the level of alarm for information. So we thought to use this new instrument. We not only as journalists, the movement which is going to do this initiative was proposed by European Alternatives and other civil society groups, organization, movements, not only journalists but also citizens. The aim is starting from the resolution of the European Parliament that was voted in March 2011, starting from the Hungarian situation. That resolution asked the Commission, the European Commission, a new law which removes the differences between European legislation and strives for broader protection of the right to information. Starting also from this kind of test, we are working about, this is a draft a first draft of the citizen initiative, whose main guidelines should be in 4 points: legislation on media ownership and control. The audience share should be taken into account because it's the best parameter which represents the ability of a means to influence public opinion. Second, indicating the subject having a term of office in government or in parliament, which cannot therefore control companies operating in the communication sector. Disqualified persons, in Italy we used to say conflict of interest, even if we haven't solved the problem. Third, ensuring independence of the public TV and radio broadcasting service. Fourth, ensuring impartiality and independence of the authorities which regulate and control the audiovisual sector. In these weeks, we are debating, also with the help of experts, just to understand if these aims can be reached according to the competencies of the European Union, the European Commission. This is, in this moment, our main problem. This is also a way to ask you to help us to solve this problem. But we think that we need to use also European citizens. We think that pluralism can't be only a market problem. We think that it's important that we watch at the media problems not only from the media market logic. We think that we have to put on the category of citizenship, of European citizenship, at the basis of our debate on pluralism. So we hope that we can use the starting point of European citizenship as instrument to get new rules. In other words, and finally, we think as Union that we are debating, while we are debating about pluralism of information, also about what we think Europe has to be. In these weeks, in these months, we clearly see that Europe is almost only financial criteria, financial debate, financial rules. Somebody says Europe has the problem of a lack of soul. We think that a part of the lack of soul has also to do with this kind of values. We hope that also through this kind of debates we can put also civil rights in the building of Europe. This is the reason why when we will have completely defined the citizen initiative, we hope to have your help, even because 1 million signatures can be collected also through websites online. It should be quite easy to collect 1 million signatures. Also, if you want, with your help. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. I think we could open debate on this three intervention. That I would say that if there is one thread that links them is this idea that there is a perception that pluralism is a problem, okay? And then the question is, we are doing a methodological seminar essentially today, but the question is also if, what are the deeper questions to which we want to answer to our methodology. This part, I would say that this intervention were mostly about the questions more than the answers, and then some different methods probably to try to give some answers. But let's see if we have some more.
Yes, if you allow me, maybe, Professor Mancini will tell us again that the Commission doesn't like questions, but would like to have answers, and this is especially true in our case. So, in fact, you're probably aware of the high-level group on media, freedom and pluralism that is now working since the month of October and has to deliver concrete recommendations to either European Union or member states or the sector. And I think with all your brilliant contributions, I could bring a truck to Professor Vicky Freiberger, and it might be a bit difficult. I thought this seminar was especially interesting, but I would be grateful if you could come with solutions. So in a way, if you have good ideas, I would be quite pleased to receive them, because we need to progress on solutions. I know it looks simplistic, but if there are concrete recommendations, we are really pleased to get them.
Thank you, Susan. Okay.
So just asking for a clarification on the last point. Could you say a little bit more about the timetable? What kind of recommendations for whom? Do you have any further views on that?
So the timetable given by Commissioner Kroes to the group was 1 year. So basically, the report is expected by, let's say, November this year. It should contain concrete recommendation for the improving and policy of media freedom and media pluralism. These recommendations are not to be addressed exclusively to the European Union. They can be addressed to whatever level they will want to go, because, of course, you're all aware better than me that the limit of the competences of the European Union are quite strict. So I think it would be a bit odd just to say these are recommendations for the European Union, and then we will come and say, well, then we need to change the treaty. And it would be better to come up with things that can be implemented either via some action from the European Union or addressed to the sector or the member states. I think it can be broad, but it should be really tackling the issues of media freedom and media pluralism, both of them, even if they're closely linked, and Peggy would tell me that one contains the other, but okay. So it's 1 year, and really they will have a few other meetings before the summer, but then they will have to come up with recommendations.
Very quickly about that. As I'm sure you know, Austria, a member of the EU, has taken the lead very substantially at UN level and in the Council of Europe on practical measures by member states to comply with their own positive obligations under international law on particularly the protection of the safety and security of journalists. I mean, this is a matter of conforming with commitments that are already given, binding commitments under the International Covenant, but also the OSCE and others, of which all EU member states are members. So you ask what to do. The trouble is, people are always asking journalists what the governmental authorities should do. The governmental authorities should obey the law. You know, this is the main thing. They were talking about, you know, very large-scale abuses and, of course, also interpreting the law. I mean, in cases of journalists being threatened with jail or prosecution over revealing their sources or over handling material related to terrorism and so on. These are things which are, of course, these are nation-state laws, I absolutely accept. But the fact that you know, the Council of Europe makes soft laws and the court rules frequently against European states on breaches of the Convention. It does seem to me that the prospect of the EU becoming, you know, acceding to the Convention cries out for a general ruling by the authorities of the EU and a new political impetus by member states to say, how should we do this? And you have one member state, Austria, which has volunteered itself in this area. So not only at the UN, where in the UN next month they're going to have a special meeting in Geneva before the UN Human Rights Council to consult with all parties, this is an international thing, it's not just Europe obviously, about how to bring forward a resolution that will have some political impetus. UNESCO is looking at the institutional side of the entire UN system. And as I say, we see the European Union, in some respects, lagging, at least lagging in the sense of not running with the subject in the way that one would expect. On the political dimension, what is, I mean, again, I wrote the what I call political aspects study in the Impunity Initiative report of June of last year. Is an explicit political focus, so that in dealings with member states and with non-member states, problem countries such as Russia and Turkey, there is a due concern expressed for this in public, so that the EU can use its moral and political pressure. As we've heard occasionally, we've heard President Barroso and President Van Rompuy do, but not in a consistent way. And when you examine the record of overall dealings between the European Union and those countries, very often it looks very much as though the EU has been willing to compromise on those areas. So if the EU is to be a moral force, if we're going to have this civil society dimension to the EU, and if the EU is to recover the credibility which many opinion polls suggest that it's losing, I don't deny that the media have also lost some more of their credibility, then the political area is absolutely vital as well. And you know, this constant activity, the Parliamentary Assembly, I mean, again, the Parliamentary Assembly has in fact asked me for the second time to write a detailed report on the state of media freedom in the Council of Europe area within the next month for deliberation, which will then turn into Parliamentary Assembly activity, resolution, and come back again to the Committee of Ministers. If it goes back to the Committee of Ministers, as it did last time, they then pass a decision or a resolution to beef up protection for Article 10 in the Convention. They then leave it absolutely lying in the water for 2 years. And then it's come back again with Austria for the first time, a member state, raising this as an issue in the international body, saying, we need to focus on this. And so a new decision of the Committee of Ministers, including all 27 European ministers, was made. Why not build on those things? Why not, you know, the Council of Europe is the human rights watchdog, yes, but the European Union has a fundamental rights agency. It has excluded freedom of expression and press freedom from its remit. Why? We want to know. You know, there seems to be no constitutional reason why that should be the case. It's there in the Charter. It would be the case.
Yeah, well, I only was wearing the hat of the high-level group in this case. I'm not going to enter into the EU at large, of course, but indeed, in this case, would really try to work with concrete steps. And I think the building of the center and of the high-level group shows that there is a will to make things progress, and hopefully that the concept of press freedom or media pluralism will make some progress. And there is, I think, really at the moment a real good moment, because there are calls from the European Parliament, there are calls from NGOs and citizens towards the European Commission to act. I think it's the right moment to do something, but indeed the fundamental rights are, I mean, for the Commission it is only when EU law is to be implemented, so it's a problem.
Well, yes, I was giving to you anyway the floor because it's your turn in general. Then let me just say, is your turn. Then we'll have Gian Zilonka and Marco Gambaro, and then we stop again and take discussions. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, just generally, thank you very much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be back here. I appreciate it very much. Just in terms of the Fundamental Rights Agency, I mean, I'm wondering, there are different approaches that people are suggesting, and you've got the citizens' application, as it were, for consideration of this. But I think it's open. I'd have to look at the rules. I haven't looked at them for a while, for possibly the European Parliament or other organisations to suggest to the Fundamental Rights Agency that they take up particular issues. So that might be something that it's worth exploring and just seeing what scope there is to try and get it onto their agenda. Okay, well, I'll try and be brief. It's been a very long morning. Lots of interesting comments and suggestions and introductions to very interesting and ambitious projects that are going on. And I think I really wish that our government had read Peggy's, not Peggy's, but your team's media monitor and the indirect report some years ago. And if they had, we might have avoided some of the problems that they're encountering at the moment. The paper that I co-wrote with Damien Tambini really tried to look at some of the problems of implementing and responding to the difficulties that are flagged up. So the media monitor can indicate where there are difficulties, but the question is, how do you then take that forward and then reflect that in regulation, and regulation that's robust? And we looked really at a very limited question, a limited field. We looked at the legitimacy, the efficacy, the empirical basis for introducing structural controls. So it's a very small aspect of that, a much broader report that I think Susanna is going to be investigating. And even in that very small field, we encountered a lot of, as Christina said, a lot of complexity that makes it very difficult. And I think Damien hinted that part of this complexity depends, or is a result of different pressures. There's the pressure, once you start to think about how you implement it, there's the regulatory pressure to ensure that your mechanism is effective and it's adequate and, as Bernd said, is flexible because we're in a rapidly moving environment. You've got the pressure on the regulator also to provide something that's relatively certain for industry. You've got pressures too in terms of the credibility of the regulatory system, which means that you go back to the indirect report and the question of independence and protection from possibly either agency capture or governmental capture. And then at the end of the day, I think the one important question that I was interested in was this pressure of legality, so the scope for administrative review or review in terms of fundamental human rights. And I'm very interested to hear that the German system has been subject to review in the German courts in terms of that's legality. So either on the basis of human rights interfering with fundamental freedoms, property rights of the industry itself, trade rights, free movement, it can be configured from an EU perspective. And also fundamental rights. So I think that these different tensions, and they are impacting, and that they're sometimes pulling in very different ways. I think the other aspect that I became very aware of when I was looking at this field was the way in which empirical evidence is used to build regulation, or is not in fact used at all. And in the field that we were looking at, structural regulation, I mean, do we know whether structural regulation achieves the objectives that we want to achieve. So there's a real question about ends and means. And if you then configure into that, say, the pressure of administrative courts or Supreme Courts applying fundamental human rights, there's a pressure to try and make legislation as watertight. And that might mean, because of the complexity of the field, introducing something that's very sophisticated and very complex and is flexible. On the other hand, then that makes it very difficult for industry because they can't tell what's going to happen. So these tensions come out, and the question is, how do we know whether our measures are going to be effective? How do we know that the means are suited to the ends? And that goes back to that broader question, what is it that we're trying to achieve in terms of media pluralism in this specific field of structural controls? And I think, again, one needs to be aware that we were just looking at a very, very small sector, an important sector of state regulation. There is also a broad range of other regulatory tools, content regulation, subsidies, which play an important part. And structural controls are just a very small part of this. But in the UK, they become extremely contested. The system that we've had, the system of case-by-case review that was introduced in 2003, looking at mergers as they arise, with a very flexible test, which was not a very clear test, because although the goal was set out, or a number of goals were set out, there was no clear indication to the regulator as to how those goals should be achieved or what the mechanisms were. And so at the moment, we're subject to a review, really, to see, what are these means that can be used, and what are the ends that we should be striving to meet. And in the UK, the ends that have been seen as particularly relevant in the context of structural controls have been dealing with media power and influence, both influence over the public, which I think is very much underplayed the German approach, but there's also been another strand to that, prevention of bias, suppression of information, and those two, I think, are very closely linked, that we are concerned about media power because of the potential to influence, but also because of the potential to suppress or distort information. And does a multiplicity or an increase in the number of actors breaking down concentration actually respond to those concerns? And then the second concern that's underplayed the UK intervention is the idea that if you increase the multiplicity of actors, you're going to have some impact on the diversity of content, and that view is very much the view that's underpinned US intervention. So different countries have emphasized different goals as underpinning their structural regulation, and this might have an impact in terms of the kinds of means that they use to realize them. And if you're concerned with media power and influence, you might want to have a different set of controls. It's fairly apparent. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to work that out. A different set of measuring techniques in order to work out when the media concentration becomes inappropriate. If you're dealing with diversity, you might want to have a rather different set of controls, and they might require different thresholds or different levels of intervention. The other thing that I think that we were interested in was regulatory strategy and this balance between going for something that is fixed and clear, which was the old approach in the UK prior to 2003. It was fairly simple for industry. They knew when they were going to cross the limits, and that was then replaced as part, I think, of a deregulatory, or seen as a deregulatory agenda, by these case-by-case, more sophisticated forms of intervention. But I think the sophisticated form of intervention, the risk it runs is that you just compound difficulties, because you look at more factors that can play into your final decision, but you're not really clear. You may not have the empirical knowledge to know really what those factors actually tell you in terms of the impact on your sort of output in the media, and you end up then with something that also probably can be contested at the end of the day. So it's a very difficult balancing approach for the regulator. We're looking at it in the UK context. And interestingly, my approach, I started from a view very much in favour of a more sophisticated analysis that looks at a whole range of different factors. But I've come increasingly to the view that because of the empirical uncertainties that are in play in this field, actually it's probably better to choose something that is fairly simple, but view structural controls as just a very small part of a much bigger picture, and that we may need to have greater reliance on continuing commitment to public service, continuing commitment to quotas, or possibly levied by, as France has tried, some kind of levy on telecommunications or ISPs who are not producing content, to feed that back into a fund for production. So structural intervention, I think, is a very limited form. I think we need to be aware of the uncertainties that underpin it, but it could possibly play a useful role in a broader regulatory picture. And just to give you a couple of examples, the paper, I think, goes through some of the questions about the empirical evidence for multiplicity of actors, either, or ensuring a multiplicity of actors, either having an impact in terms of control of power and influence, but I think perhaps the argument is stronger. It becomes much more complex when you talk about multiplicity of actors and the impact either on content genres or indeed viewpoint diversity. I mean, there are different considerations at play here, and there is economic evidence that if you're dealing with a small market, a very limited market in terms of its capacity, you may, in terms of diversity, do better in allowing a high level of concentration, because money then can be expended on trying to reach all aspects of the market. So in terms of diversity in that context, you might be happier in allowing concentration, but in terms of media power and influence, you still might be extremely concerned about it. So again, it depends what your objectives and your goals are, and it might require you to rank them. But just to give you a couple of examples, the US has traditionally tried to introduce bright line regulation, so tried to introduce regulation pretty much as the UK did in the past, with clear thresholds. And the UK approach with this more sophisticated system was seen as sort of moving away from that, and the US approach would be that this opens it up to regulatory capture, to uncertainty, that this is totally illegitimate. The US tried the diversity index, which was an attempt, not I think to move away from bright line thresholds, but in fact to use techniques that are familiar and people feel comfortable with as a sort of objective technique from the competition field, to try and give greater certainty, in fact, in the field of media pluralism. But they've moved away from that, and I think what's very interesting, they've moved to a case-by-case approach. They've moved away from this bright line approach, and they've set a number of thresholds which create presumptions. So if you own more than a certain percentage in the market, that creates a presumption that it's illegitimate, and you can either automatically reverse that presumption by showing it's a failing firm situation, or raise a number of specified objectives which concern your investment in original news production. So you can play off the concern that you might have in terms of concentration with showing that you can make a positive commitment to diversity in another area. You keep your news editorial team separate. So they've moved towards, this was struck down in Prometheus 2, but I think, as my understanding, this is the way the US is going to go. The UK tried the more sophisticated, or at least opened the door to a much more sophisticated review. And if you look, for anyone who's interested in an attempt by a regulator to come up with an evidential base and come up with a fairly sophisticated analysis, although it's been heavily criticised, and again, you can see the complexity. If you try to go sophisticated, you open yourself up to a review on so many different counts, but it's Ofcom's attempt to create a way of evaluating the proposed merger between News Corp and B-Sky B in the UK. And they developed what was, I think, quite an original approach. I don't think it's by any means sufficient, but they looked at the regularity with which people accessed news sources. And it's interesting because it's across media. It didn't involve any weighting. So you've got these questions about underlying policy questions behind all this, which renders them contestable, but they didn't weight media. So they treated audio, video, text, and I think Peggy's absolutely right. The internet is not a particularly useful component here. I think you need to think about audio, video, text. These are the key elements to the media environment. And they opened it up potentially for individuals to cite any source that they found that they used regularly. So it also is flexible enough to incorporate a blog. If a blog is up there on the scale in terms of use, it could actually have featured. I mean, of course it didn't, but so it's potentially very, very open-ended. This wasn't the only thing that the Ofcom looked at. They also looked at reach. They looked at the duration of exposure. So they also looked at the amount of time that people were accessing sources. And they also recognized that multiplicity of sources and the way that people cross-refer could be useful, although they didn't know how to factor it into their ultimate conclusion, so therefore they didn't play. They put their main emphasis on the regularity of use that people made of particular sources. I'm not sure that on its own is convincing, and the Dutch media authority has suggested duration of exposure as possibly being a more relevant method for assessing influence. I'm not going to talk anymore because we've talked about these various metrics and we've discussed them in our paper, and would be very, very welcome. I find this an incredibly difficult area, and I'm not an economist, and any sort of comments that people could give to us on that. So I won't talk any more really about that, but do please have a look at the paper. We also discuss a little bit the use of indices, so the use of the HHI, and I think as Peggy mentioned, this NOME index, and whether the use of indices can create greater clarity or objectivity to the system. I think they could have a role, and I think they can be configured, but you need to be very clear about how you're using them. And if you applied those certainly to the UK context, and we've had a researcher who's been working with us, who is Davide Morisi, he has done a very good reference to Ofcom, where he goes through these different indices and works out how they would, what the results would be in the UK context. And interesting, if you do apply them in the UK context, you find that you have a highly concentrated market on any of these indices. So they can act as a trigger also to suggest that there is a problem in the market. So a real problem for regulators in terms of what the evidence tells them, how they can be flexible, and how they can meet these various, I think, conflicting demands that are there in the market at any one time. And I think, as I say, the interesting thing is I came much more in favour of fixed limits than I ever thought I would in this particular context. So thank you.
Thank you.